Okay, good afternoon to everyone joining in. We still see some participants joining in, but we can get started with the opening remarks and welcoming remarks just to set the stage right now for the webinar. Welcome to the sixth installment of the SPARK program's webinar series. My name is Malvika. I'm a consultant from Carbon Limits, and I will be your moderator for today. In today's webinar, we will be focusing on the Toolbox publication, Article 6 Governance Frameworks in Action. This report provides comparative case studies from 6 host countries, looking into the frameworks, institutional arrangements, and procedures established in these countries. So we will be deep diving into the countries of Cambodia, Ghana, Rwanda, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. We will also learn more about this from our panelists who will be speaking after our report authors in today's webinar. And this afternoon, we have Dr. Alick Muvundika, who is the Deputy Director of the National Institute of Scientific and Industrial Research in Zambia. We are looking forward to the discussions and Q&A with our speakers today. So let's get started with a few housekeeping notes before we begin the proceedings of today. This session is being recorded and it will be available on GGGI's YouTube channel after the webinar. The Article 6 Toolbox guides are also available on the SPARK website. At the same location, you will also be able to find the case studies report. Please use the QR code that you see on the screen to access these guides and the report. You can also use the Q&A function on Zoom. If you toggle to the bottom of your screen, you can see the Q&A function right next to the chat function or the share function if you're one of the panelists. Please use this to raise any questions that you might have. We have dedicated sessions with both the authors of the report and with the special guest today during our webinar. And to help us improve future webinars, we have a short survey that will appear on your screen right towards the end of the webinar. It will be great if you could help answer this survey. It helps us improve the webinars that we schedule in the future. So let's look at the agenda for today. The webinar begins with some introduction and opening remarks that will introduce the SPARK program. And this will be followed by a presentation on the report content by Paula Hoffman and Randall Spalding-Fetcher. We will have a short Q&A after this. As mentioned, please use the Q&A function to raise any questions that you might have on the content. And after the Q&A, we will hear from Dr. Muvundika, carbon market specialist from Zambia, before ending the webinar with a feedback survey and Q&A with our guest speaker. So with that, I would like to introduce the ICI program structure. Supporting preparedness for Article 6 cooperation, or SPARK, is a 5-year multi-country program that was launched in 2022. The implementation is led by Global Green Growth Institute, or GGGI, and it is also supported by a consortium of partners that consists of UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, GFA Consulting Group, KPC, and Carbon Limits. So this project aims to support countries to increase climate ambition by enhancing readiness of Colombia, Pakistan, Thailand, and Zambia to participate in international carbon market under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And to achieve this, the project aims to support governments with policy and regulatory frameworks that are needed to participate in the market, along with trying to increase the private sector engagement. Next slide, please. The Article 6 Toolbox within the SPARK program, it draws on the consortium's diverse experience in Article 6 activity development to help create guidance and tools that can be used in the target countries. So the toolbox development will also promote consistency across the different countries and improve the efficiency in its delivery. So one of the core principles will be the adaptability of the toolbox to different scenarios that can help fit the national conditions over the course of the program. So the first set of outputs in the Article 6 Toolbox are 6 guides that target the fundamental needs of host party governments on one hand and activity participants on the other hand. So out of the 6 guides, 3 cater to the host party governments, 2 are tailored to activity participants. This could be both public or private sector activity participants. And the one on ambition and transformational change kind of encapsulate aspects from both sides. Next slide, please. But when we refer to the Article 6 toolbox, we don't refer to just the 6 guides. It goes beyond that. It also includes the development of training materials, potential tools, and other additional resources that can support capacity building within the 4 countries that we have been referring to. So the Spark Toolbox guides, which were first released during COP28, they provide a structured and foundational knowledge on the key aspects of Article 6. But because the Article 6 landscape is evolving rapidly, there is a growing need for more current and detailed real-world insights. So that's where the case studies report comes in. While the guides explain the what and how, the case study report illustrates how it's actually being done in different countries. And it also offers an opportunity for peer learning among countries and an information source for project developers in the covered countries. So that was a brief introduction to the SPARK program, the Article 6 toolbox, and how this case study report kind of fits into the bigger picture of the Key SPARK program. So with that, I would like to invite our speakers, Randall and Paula, to know more about the case study report. So I'll pass it on to you now, Randall.
Thank you, Vika. Let's see, let me make sure. Okay. Thanks very much, Vika. And thank you all for being here. It's great to have such a large audience. I mean, this is, in a way, you're part of the mission of the SPARK program, because by participating here, we're really hoping to help people understand these issues better. So I'm going to just give a very short introduction to how we kind of got going in this project, but then Paolo's going to be the one who really digs into the results. So next slide. So what were we trying to do with this case studies work? We wanted to really map how different countries are actually going about this Article 6 strategy process. So how are they thinking about opportunities? How are they navigating the risks of selling too many mitigation outcomes? What kind of institutional arrangements they have in place? And I should say that, you know, we started this work almost a year ago. I just checked this morning. And at that time, there weren't that many countries that had published comprehensive strategies. So that's why, although we have a smaller group that we'll talk about today, of course, many more countries are now taking up the challenge and moving into this field and publishing their frameworks. So we wanted to take that information about a select number of countries and then do some comparisons to ask, you know, are countries taking the same approach to each issue, or is there a great diversity of approaches to some of these questions? And part of the reason we were doing that is to address the questions we kept getting, because when we would give a presentation about, say, Article 6 strategy or setting up institutional arrangements, the first question we would always get is, well, yes, but show me what other countries are doing here so I can get some understanding of where my country should go. And so this case studies publication was meant to be the answer to that. And I will say, just as an aside, we're busy with more country case studies. And so watch this space. I think by the middle of this year, we'll have a lot more information on a wider range of countries published in these areas. All right, good. We can go to the next slide. So the framework here is we tried to break down Article 6 readiness into several different pieces. And I should first say the focus of this case studies really is on the government side of things, although there's also a lot of important activity happening in activity development. We were focusing here on, if you're a host country, guides 2 and 3 talk about what you need to do to get ready. And so the case studies were to answer, well, how did people actually go about doing this? So some of the issues we covered were, for example, if a country had published an Article 6, say, framework or strategy, what did that actually cover? Did it cover both out of independent crediting mechanisms that used to be mainly for the voluntary market? Did it cover the new Article 6.4 mechanism? What was the coverage there? And in terms of overall strategy, for example, did the country decide they weren't going to allow crediting outside the scope of their NDC or not? So there are some key strategic issues there. What type of institutional arrangements did they have in place? Particularly, how did they make decisions about the authorization of cooperative approaches and mitigation outcomes? The procedures, although there's a pretty basic activity cycle that you will find in Guide 5 that talks about developing activities, there are differences in how countries are approaching this in the early stages. Many people are very interested in fees and sharing and things like that, so we tried to look at what different countries are doing there, the registry choices they're making, how they're doing authorization, and some early reporting. You'll see the 6 countries that are covered here, but Paula will talk a little bit more about that choice. So next, on to the next slide. So I will now turn it over to Paula Hoffman. She was really the one driving this. She's a consultant here at Carbon Limits. It was the person who really dug into the detail, including discussing some of our results with some of the countries to make sure we had the correct understanding of what they were doing. So with that, I will turn it over to Paula to continue.
Thank you, Randall. Super happy to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It has been an exciting journey for me, actually, engaging with the governance frameworks of these countries. I think for many years, Article 6 was quite on the theory side of things. A lot of the rules were evolving over the past years, and the question was always, how would this look when it's actually implemented? And this is what we got to look at now when writing up these case studies and looking at these countries' frameworks. We're actually getting a quite good picture of how the implementation and operationalization of Article 6 looks like in specific national contexts. With that, I want to give a short disclaimer that this presentation does not cover all the aspects that are covered by the report. So if you are curious for more, then please check out the report. In the report, you will find the detailed studies of the governance frameworks of these countries, broken up in these elements that Randall earlier talked about, and you will find the comparative figures, of which some I will present now. So, as previously mentioned, the many host countries that have expressed their interest in using market-based mechanisms under Article 6 are at different stages of their engagement currently, both in terms of institutional readiness, but also practical implementation. And when starting the development of the case studies, the first and most important question for us was whether the country has actually published a policy framework that governs participation. So this was the basic requirement for us when selecting the countries for our study, because if there's no framework, then there is nothing for us to assess. And Randall already mentioned that we started this exercise in early 2024. And since then, the market has been evolving quite a lot, and many more countries came out with their governance frameworks. But at that point in time, there weren't actually so many frameworks to look at, and this is why we came up with a selection of these 6 countries. This said, we are very much aware that the landscape is evolving. I already mentioned it, and Randall mentioned it as well, that by now we have a lot more countries and that we're also planning to look at these frameworks. And also we're noting that even some of the countries that we have looked at that feature in the case studies have by now updated their frameworks or released additional guidelines, additional procedures governing other aspects. So these updates will hopefully also feature in our forthcoming publications. So what did we actually look at? We looked at the operational manual for the implementation of Article 6 for Cambodia. We looked at Ghana's framework on international carbon markets. We looked at Rwanda's national carbon market framework. We looked at the environmental management, control, and management of carbon trading regulations and guidelines from Tanzania. We also looked at Zambia's guidelines for the submission and evaluation of proposed mitigation activities under Article 6, Part 1. And we looked at Zimbabwe's carbon credits trading general regulations that were published in 2023. And what you see in the comparative figure is that these documents actually have differences in terms of the scope of their coverage. Randall already mentioned it, but for example, you can see that almost all of the countries cover institutions and basic procedures in their core regulatory documents, but not all of them have articulated a clear carbon market strategy. Another difference that we can see is that some countries have made the choice to publish their framework as a policy document. So, for example, the title of Cambodia already gives it away, Operations Manual, or also Ghana's framework on international carbon markets. These are policy documents, whereas other countries such as Tanzania and Zimbabwe have chosen the form of legislation that got approved by Parliament. And this has, of course, to do with the legal and constitutional system of the respective countries and also with the powers of the ministry in charge. But there may have also been other considerations that were important, such as, for example, the ease with which these documents can be adapted later to adjust for the evolution of the market, or also whether a country had a pre-existing instrument that governed carbon markets, which could simply be adapted. Or sometimes also time pressures can figure in the decision to choose a certain format. For example, saying we really need to have our strategy, our institutions and procedures in place. And then we decide to focus our document on this. But for example, our registry procedures can wait because for now we can either outsource the service or we keep working on it, and this can come at a later point in time. And if you're wondering what is the difference between not available and under development, this is simply that for those that are ticked under development, so here specifically the registry part, the policy document that we analyzed actually provided the basis for the establishment of separate procedures that will govern these aspects. So we know that these are under development, however, not released. Next. So before I continue with my presentation, I just wanted to quickly stop here because we want to launch a short question to you as the audience. About Article 6. The question that we want to pose to you is, does a host country require a bilateral agreement with a buyer country under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism? So Article 6.4, like in the case of Article 6.2. And you can select 3 answers on the pop-up window on your screen. We will have the question up for 1 minute, and yes, please feel free to mark your answer. And I will later then, together with you, have a look at the results and elaborate a bit. Okay, so before I continue, we have the result of our poll question. And the majority of people said no, host country does not have to have in place a bilateral agreement with a buyer country under the Paris Agreement. And this is actually the correct answer. A bilateral agreement between the host country and the buyer country is not a formal requirement under Article 6.4, unlike for Article 6.2, where bilateral agreements are used to operationalize the cooperation between countries. So under Article 6.2, countries cooperate directly, and bilateral agreements are essential to define how emissions reductions will be authorized and transferred. Whereas under Article 6.4, the mechanism is centrally supervised by the UNFCCC through the Article 6.4 supervisory body. But that said, host country authorization is also necessary for the international transfer of mitigation outcomes generated under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. And some countries might sign bilateral agreements where they agree to, for example, utilize the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism and clarify mutual expectations or provide political backing, but it's not a formal requirement. So thank you for participating. I think we can move on with another interesting 6 framework documents, which is how and to what extent they cover different crediting mechanisms. Most of the reviewed carbon market documents and the case studies cover mitigation activities under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, the bilateral and independent crediting mechanisms. independent crediting mechanisms here refer to those crediting standards that are not governed by any international treaty or regional, national, subnational regulation, but which have traditionally catered mostly to the demand-driven voluntary carbon markets, popular examples being the VCS or the gold standard. And we see from the comparison that Cambodia is actually the only country whose document only covers Article 6.2 transactions based on the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism and bilateral crediting mechanisms, while the other countries' documents also include provisions for how credits from independent crediting mechanisms may be used in Article 6.2 transfers. All of the documents cover authorized uses of mitigation outcomes, which is somehow natural since we selected them for being Article 6 framework documents, but only a minority addresses non-authorized uses of mitigation outcomes. And what this suggests to us is that most countries still need to resolve the future interface between Article 6 and the VCN when looking at the demand side. Next slide. Thanks. We can also compare how countries are choosing to tie crediting and international transfers to their NDC targets. This very much relates to Article 6 strategies, and Article 6 strategy serves host parties to select, for example, the sectors, approaches to the private sector, and also navigating opportunities and risks for the NDC achievement. And in our comparison, we were in particular interested whether and how the strategy mentions the country's NDC goals and connects these to authorizations and transfers under Article 6. So, for example, we were asking ourselves, do countries limit the use of unconditional NDC actions for Article 6, for example, to avoid selling low-hanging fruits, or do they limit the use of activities outside of the scope of the NDC? And the analysis shows that almost all the countries allow for crediting and international transfers based on activities listed in conditional NDC targets. But of those countries actually differentiating between conditional and unconditional NDC targets, none allows for the crediting and transfers of mitigation outcomes from actions listed in the unconditional NDC. I already said relevant here is that countries make the differentiation between conditional and unconditional NDC targets, which is not a given. And this is why we, for example, in Tanzania see that the document rather speaks of priority sectors than of conditional or unconditional NDC targets. And we also saw that most of the countries do not specify the treatment of activities that are outside of the scope that is covered by the NDC. Institutional arrangements are part of the fundamental prerequisites for host countries to participate in Article 6, and assigning roles and responsibilities to institutions basically allows them to be prepared for all the actions required, including authorizations, the execution of transfers of ITMOs for different purposes, to track and account and periodically report on mitigation outcomes. So they are a core part of an effective Article 6 framework that promotes institutional coordination and that can also build on existing capacities. And when comparing the institutional arrangements of the countries from our case studies, we see that almost all of them have already allocated the key roles and responsibilities for engaging in Article 6 transactions. But what we also see is that these institutional arrangements are quite diverse. Some of the countries, for example, involve committees composed of various entities, such as ministries and directorates for the Article 6 policy coordination, for example, in Ghana and Rwanda, whereas others have policy decisions being taken by single ministries or departments. Countries also differ in assigning the role of the authorization entity, so the institution that is in charge of issuing authorizations. They either choose the lead ministry or the department within the lead ministry, And these different choices are, of course, again, highly reflective of the national context. For example, the regulatory mandates in place for the possible institutions to carry out these Article 6 functions, but also legal, institutional, and political aspects. And we were also interested in looking at the different procedures being established by these governance frameworks. Randall already mentioned earlier that there is quite a generic idea of how an activity cycle for Article 6 could look like, but there's some specific choices that countries can make. And we were, for example, interested in looking at approval procedures. Contrary to the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, the approval of mitigation outcomes or a mitigation activity by the host country as a procedural step is not required by the Article 6.2 guidance. However, what we found in the case studies is that 4 out of the 6 countries that we analyzed actually require that all mitigation activities, regardless of whether they're developed under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, bilateral crediting mechanisms, or independent crediting mechanisms, are actually required to seek approval by the responsible national entity before they begin with their implementation. And in these countries, this step may be called differently, and also the result. So the official document issued by the responsible governmental institution may be called differently. For example, Ghana even has this differentiation between bilateral crediting mechanisms, where then after this approval process, activity participants receive a letter of recommendation to proceed to the validation stage and initiate authorization, whereas in the context of independent crediting mechanisms for activities, this is called a letter of endorsement, but basically it amounts to the same, a so-called approval criteria. And in all of these countries, approval must be usually obtained prior to the implementation of activities. Host countries can also specify the eligibility of a mitigation activity for authorization by using different approaches. We were interested in looking at these different approaches. They can, for example, use negative lists to indicate which type of activities are not eligible for authorization, or they can introduce positive lists of activities that are considered eligible. And so far, our research showed that countries use either a positive list of eligible activities or a negative list for ineligible ones, or a combination of the two. But what we also found is that positive and negative lists can actually mean different things in different countries. So, for example, both in Cambodia and Ghana, mitigation activities on the positive list confer automatic additionality, but they do not guarantee that your activity actually eventually receives authorization. Both in Ghana and Zambia, mitigation activities on the negative list are ineligible for authorization, whereas in Cambodia, mitigation activities that are not on the positive list are ineligible for authorization. And in Rwanda, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe, we are still waiting for specified authorization procedures and criteria, and we do not know yet whether they will have positive or negative lists. But at the time of writing these case studies, only Cambodia and Ghana had already established and published a list of specific criteria that mitigation activities would have to meet for receiving authorizations. So this may come on top of the positive list as part of the authorization process. So only these 2 countries had this in place. We also compared the structures for fees and shares of proceeds in the different countries, and we found that the reviewed countries have introduced them for very different purposes, or a number of different purposes. Not all of the countries have a fee structure in place yet. This can also bear testimony to maybe the difficult process that it can be to establish such a structure. But all of those countries that have imposed levies have imposed some to cover administrative costs of national carbon market activities. And usually these fees, these type of fees, for example, a registration fee, will be used to cover governmental, administrative, and management expenses that are associated with the operation of the carbon market. In addition, many countries also establish fees that serve objectives beyond the coverage of administrative and management expenses, and earnings from these charges are often committed to fund mitigation or adaptation activities, for example, through strategic investments into national climate action plans, innovation and technology development. And some countries like Rwanda and Zimbabwe, they also introduce benefit sharing requirements, benefit sharing, for example, with local communities in order to promote inclusive and equitable outcomes of mitigation activities. What is interesting also is that no country explicitly requires a contribution to overall mitigation of global emissions outside of the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. The so-called OMGE is required under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism and encouraged under Article 6.2. But we see that countries such as Ghana, for example, encourage the contribution to OMGE, but have this as a voluntary contribution. Yes, and with this, I pass it back to Vika to introduce our audience poll, and I'm very happy and look forward to your questions in the upcoming Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula and Randall, for your presentation. A note to the audience, you should have seen a poll pop up in front of you, and this is just for us to know if you have learned something new. And while you answer this poll, I will continue my conversation with Paula and Randall. And like they have mentioned, this is a very short and abridged version of the report. And of course, there are a lot more details in the actual report. So the link has been shared with you in chat. So please feel free to download the report and review it. And we are also happy to receive any feedback that you might have on the report. Is there something that you would like to see more? Because we are planning to add more countries to the case studies report. So we'd be very happy to receive any feedback that you might have. So, Paula, while the audience are answering the poll, maybe you can tell us a bit about how countries are integrating the voluntary carbon market within their emerging Article 6 frameworks.
Yeah, sure. I think this is a very interesting and relevant question that is also the subject of a lot of debates in the current international carbon market environment. And what we have seen so far is that in the governance frameworks that we looked at, countries are so far focusing these interactions or the governance of these interactions on the supply side. So instead of regulating yet the use of credits, they decide to focus on trying to make the activities in the voluntary carbon markets align better with their national climate targets and goals. So this is, for example, why we see them introduce approval procedures or also procedures for non-objection for activities that are meant for the voluntary carbon markets in order to basically be able to get an overview, first of all, of the activities that exist in the country, but then also to assess them against maybe certain criteria that support national alignment.
Thank you, Paula. While the poll is still open, I would like to move on to the Q&A from the audience directly. So here are some questions that we have from the members. There's a lot of questions, so I'm trying to filter all of the questions to make it a very interesting discussion. So based on your experience while working on this report, have you found that countries start their Article 6 functions and development of the framework while they still don't have a registry in place?
Yeah, actually, that is quite common. We have one of the elements that we looked at the case studies report is registries. However, we decided to go not very much into detail in this analysis because of the fact that in many countries registries are still under development. This is also, of course, due to the fact that this is a complex matter. What I can say, what we have observed when comparing these governance frameworks and also looking at kind of the national policy decisions is that many countries strive to build their own national registries. So they're currently in the process on working on that. While there is, of course, also the possibility on drawing on existing services, as for example, the registries provided from independent crediting mechanisms. But many countries, in fact, are building their own national registries.
Thank you, Paula. There is another question on a policy template, sort of. So the question is, are there large differences in the context between the countries in terms of the policies and regulations that are put in place? Or is there an ideal policy template that could be adapted lightly or very little and still be appropriate for most of the countries?
So I think this is a very interesting question because basically our research set out to also clarify this, right? We have all these guidelines that were being developed as part of the SPARC guides, even where we were theorizing on, what would ideally all be governed by a framework, what needs to figure and how. But then the case study set out to see what is actually happening. And I think it very much kind of confirms a first hunch that although there are certain elements that need to be covered by all of the countries, so maybe that's closest to an ideal framework because there are just certain prerequisites that are needed to operationalize Article 6. There are national differences that have to do with constitutional and regulatory systems in place, capacities, and all of these things that influence decision making. And this is why we see these differences. So in short, my answer would be yes, there are elements that need to be covered by a governance framework, but there are different choices that can be made by countries. And this is also what we see as evidence in the case studies.
Perfect. Thank you, Paula. Brandel, is there anything you would like to add to this question or the questions we discussed previously?
Yeah, thanks. What I would add to this question is that I think you'll see that there's a difference between the principle and the application of the principle. So let me give you an example. A principle would be, if you as a government have identified specific activities that you think are the best ones to meet your unconditional goals, because they're, for example, the most cost-effective and aligned with national policies, it's probably not a good idea to use those for Article 6, because then you must replace them with something more expensive. How about the application of that work, though? In a country that has a very ambitious unconditional goal, right? The application of that principle might be you don't do a lot of Article 6 cooperation because you have a very ambitious goal, you know what you need to do, and that covers most of the available options up to a relatively high cost. On the other hand, if you're a country that doesn't have such a stringent goal, or maybe there are countries that don't have unconditional goals at all. There are countries who have entirely conditional goals in their NDC. In that case, the application of this principle would say, you can probably authorize a lot of activities and not compromise your compliance with your NDC goals. So the principle stays the same, but the application to that country's context based on what's in their NDC and what mitigation options they have available to them, the outcome will be different.
Thank you very much, Randall. That brings me to a question that is on the conditional and unconditional NDC commitment. So it says the conditional versus unconditional NDC commitments is very central to many of the eligibility requirements, and sometimes it can be quite uninformative and misleading as well sometimes. So what advice would you give to a host party government in this context to bring more clarity in this case and also help with the development of the framework?
Could I maybe follow up on that? Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And I'm a real stickler for language, right? And it's because I think the way we say things matters. So when someone says, oh, I want to authorize something towards my conditional NDC, that's not possible. There's authorization. You authorize anything, you have to corresponding adjustment. The way to understand this, again, like I said before, is if you have decided as a country that certain low-cost activities are the best strategy for you to meet the goal that you committed to without international support, then you need to probably ring fence that, right? Focus on those for your domestic action, and then find other opportunities for Article 6. And that's in the area that might, and those might be specified as actions that can be used to meet your conditional NDC. But ultimately, ultimately, this is really about kind of trade-off of opportunities and kind of costs. Everything has to be adjusted, but we think that, again, that the principle can be important and valuable in deciding, for example, like Pauli showed, do you want to have a negative list of activities? And a negative list might come out of those that you think are most important to make sure you can cost effectively meet what you've committed to unconditionally.
Thank you, Randall. Paula, is there anything you want to add to that question?
I don't have much to add, to be honest.
Okay, then we can move on to, we have time for one last question before we look at the poll results. There's a question on the CMA decision. So have you analyzed the CMA decision on Article 6.4 with regard to the requirement or lack thereof for the bilateral agreements between countries for ITMO transfers under Article 6.4? So it would be, they want to hear your opinion on this topic, whether what you think about this CMA decision. Randall, would you like to say something about this?
Yeah, it's funny. I did see this question pop up, and I was trying to, because I try to keep these documents on my desk, actually, because they're so important. If I'm not mistaken, the term bilateral agreement, you will not find anywhere in any of the CMA decisions. The reason we have bilateral agreements is because this is new, right? And countries were a little bit worried, especially take a country like Switzerland, where you're kind of delegating another organization, the Click Foundation, to strike these deals for you, and as opposed to the government doing it directly. They wanted to understand and to be clear with their partners how this was going to work. But ultimately, 6.2 explains exactly how these transfers happen and how their authorization happens. So if 6.4 units are issued and one country says, I'm willing to authorize this for another country to use, end of story, it's going to happen. And in their biennial transparency report, they should report those in the annual report. So bilateral agreements are something that smooths the way, that gives confidence to various partners, especially if you're trying to bring in non-state actors, so they understand the framework. But the basic rules are all in the decisions already. And I think what you will see, it's too bad Fenella Awan could not be with us today because she's very knowledgeable about this, but I think 5 years from now, I don't think any 6.4 transactions or transactions using those PACM units will necessarily have bilateral agreements behind them, because the units are there, the mechanism for accounting is very clear, everybody will be doing their reporting, and I don't think we'll need it. But I think they've been very important in these early years when we were trying to get to grips with how exactly is this process going to work.
Thank you very much, Randall and Paula, for the presentation and for taking the time to answer the audience questions. Let's see what the audience have to say about our poll. It seems like majority of them have had some new content or insights that they've received as part of this presentation and the Q&A that we had. There is still one person who thinks they are a pro in this topic. I hope they give us feedback on our report as well, so we can improve this and add content that is useful for everyone. But thank you very much. And there are still some unanswered questions in the Q&A. So if you could stay and possibly type answers while we move on to the next session, that will be very helpful for the audience who have taken the time to ask these questions. Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Randall. So it's now time for our next session with our guest speaker for the day. We are very happy to have Dr. Muvundika with us today. He has served on various environmental and climate change committees, both locally and internationally, and is quite knowledgeable on the framework of Zambia as well. So without further ado, I would like to pass it to Dr. Muvundika. And just a note for our audience, please continue using the Q&A function to ask any questions that you might have for our guest speaker today, and we will take them after their presentation. On to you, Dr. Muvundika.
Thank you, Malavika, and thank you for having me. So, as introduced, my name is Alick Muvundika from Zambia. I'm the chairperson for the technical committee, which in essence is our DNA in the country in Zambia. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about our regulatory environment, as it relates to Article 6. Next slide. Okay, so let's delve into the government policy strategy on carbon markets. So recently, the Zambian government passed into law an act called the Green Economy and Climate Change Act. This was actually passed into law or promulgated in December 2024. So the act defines and regulates mitigation and adaptation activities, including carbon markets. It also defines mandatory GHG emission reporting for key sectors and the establishment of an IMRV system for accounting of GHG. We had a carbon market framework for some time. I think the one you looked at was the initial one. But now we have a full-fledged carbon market framework. I'll explain what is remaining with it being complete. It's actually a very, very comprehensive document that guides both would-be project developers, and also it gives guidance on the processes that we use in reviewing documents that have been submitted. So the carbon market framework includes project eligibility criteria. It also includes an approval and permit processes. It includes guidance on transition of VCM activities to Article 6 activities, including the treatment of VCM without corresponding adjustment. This is key because of what project developers who are undertaking VCM projects, but they don't want to apply corresponding adjustment. So our carbon market framework caters for such, and I'll explain more, how that is done. So the carbon market framework also has fees, and I think it's similar to other fees which have been alluded to earlier. So these fees are meant to support the work of the DNA. So these fees are different from the share of proceeds. So the fees are only charged when a project developer submits a main as well as an MADD. So as I indicated, this is basically aimed at helping sustain the operations of the DNA. If you look at our carbon market framework at the moment, the fees are not, we already have the fees in place, but they are not for public consumption yet, both the fees and the share of proceeds. For one simple reason, much as we have an act in place, we are still finalizing the regulations to operationalize the act. So once the regulations are out, which we hope to do that within the next coming 2 months, then the fees as well as the SOPs that will be applicable will be for public consumption. So that's the only thing missing in our carbon market framework at the moment. The fees and the share of proceeds are not yet for public consumption, but we have them, we've already come up with them. It's just that we need the law to, back us in order for us to start collecting those fees. So the fees and share of proceeds are applicable to all GHG mitigation activities that do ask for SOP. The fees will be applicable for projects that ask for corresponding adjustment, but the fees will be applicable for all the projects all the project developers that will submit projects for review by the DNA, both those that will need to ask for corresponding adjustment and those that will not. So the fees are different. If you, for instance, submit a main, you pay a certain fee. If you submit a detailed document, which we now call the MADD, the fee is also different. So the carbon market framework also gives guidance on reporting of carbon projects in the National Carbon Registry and our IMRV system. We also have the SI66. This has been there for some time, and before we came up with the carbon market framework, this was the applicable legislation, Climate Change Act. This will have to revised. It will have to be revised so that it aligns with the new act. Next slide. Yes, so in terms of framework, the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment, through the support of the SPARC program, has developed the carbon market framework, and really I must commend the SPARC program for helping us do this. We wouldn't have been where we are without the SPARC program. So they helped us develop the carbon market framework, but also helped us establish associated structures, and is currently driving forward the implementation of Article 6 activities in the country. So the framework is envisioned to enhance the following: promote activity development, meet all requirements of Article 6, and also ensure NDC compliance and policy coordination. Next slide. Let's move to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So in terms of institutional processes for Article 6 carbon market operationalization progress, currently we have the Ministry of Green Economy and we have the Green Economy and Climate Change Act, which has established the institutional processes for the coordination of carbon market activities in Zambia. So in terms of the institutional arrangements, we have the Ministry of Green Economy, responsible for overseeing the regulation of carbon markets, as well as bilateral engagements with prospective Article 6.2 acquiring parties. Right now, we are busy with the Swiss. We've signed MOUs with Singapore and Norway, but with the Swiss, we're actually busy with the actual bilateral agreements, and we should be starting bilateral agreements with Singapore. Germany has also indicated interest after the new government, so we should be engaging with the Germans pretty soon. So we have the ministry. So below the ministry, we have the technical committee, which I chair. It's called Technical Committee and Technical Subcommittee on Climate Change. So if you look at the old CDM system, this in essence is actually the DNA. So this serves as a technical working group for the operationalizing of Article 6 and is the authority for assessing, approving, or rejecting Article 6 opportunities or activities. So this is a think tank, in terms of looking at potential Article 6 projects that have been submitted by the project developers. Then we have also the Zambia Environmental Management Agency, which is a parastatal body under the Ministry of Green Economy. This one fulfills delegated functions, and it fulfills technical requirements under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, including the MRV and account GHG inventory, registry operations, reporting, and corresponding adjustments. So our registry will be housed by this agency, the Environmental Management Agency. So we also have a secretariat under the Ministry of Green Economy. So secretariat functions are provided by the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment. So the department is called Department for Green Economy and Climate Change. So this is the secretariat to my technical committee. So when we hold meetings, the department provides secretarial services. So now going forward, the carbon market framework has established the processes and procedures for the operationalization of carbon markets under Article 6. Very, very comprehensive. It has also established processes and procedures for VCM activity in Zambia. So previously, we used to have a lot of VCM projects which we didn't even know about. But the moment the carbon market framework was operationalized, all VCM projects are now required to be registered. So they're all required to submit what we call a main. If they want to transition to Article 6, then they can do an MADD and then later on apply for corresponding adjustment. So the carbon market, carbon registry and integrated management reporting and verification systems has been also established. And as I said, this one will be managed by the Zambia Environmental Management Agency, delegated by the Minister of Green Economy and Environment. Next slide. So now let's look a bit more in detail the carbon market framework. That just shows you a picture of Zambia. So you're all encouraged to come and visit us, and see the beauty of the country. Next slide. Okay, so our carbon market framework is anchored on 3 fundamental principles. The first one is environmental integrity. So these are the principles that we look at when we're reviewing at any project that has been submitted by a project developer or project proponent. It's anchored on 3 fundamental principles. 1, environmental integrity. So the mitigation outcomes must be measured, must be transparent, and there must be application of conservative and reproducible values. The second one is ambition raising. It allows, the activity must allow Zambia to do more. It must help us to contribute to the global efforts of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Thirdly, and more important, submitted to our committee, it must show its contribution to sustainable development. This is very key, and our government is very, very particular because Zambia is too, our emissions are too negligible, although correspondingly they're going up. But in terms of our emissions are still quite low. And so our participation in the carbon market should contribute to sustainable development. And the pillar that we really look for is how does a project contribute to Zambia's sustainable development? For instance, in terms of employment creation. So we would have a lot of projects that would be submitted, and they're saying we'll be importing cook stoves. We actually encourage project developers to set up assembly plants, because then such a project would contribute to our sustainable development in terms of creating employment for our youths, but also provide opportunities for other companies that will provide other services. So that really is very, very key. Contribution of a project to sustainable development is one fundamental principle that we look out for when we're reviewing a project. Next slide. Okay, so let's look at the new project development eligibility criteria. So the new project eligibility criteria requires projects to show environmental integrity, sustainable development, and ambition raising, which I've just alluded to. So under these, projects must have mitigation outcomes that can be measured in an accurate, transparent, conservative, and reproducible manner. It must contribute to Zambia's sustainable development. It must also raise Zambia's NDC ambition and allow the country to do more. So approval of projects will be based on meeting all 3 key principles on environmental integrity, sustainable development, and ambition raising. If a project that has been submitted does not contribute or does not speak to any of these 3 principles, then we'll turn it down. So this is very, very, key for us. All these 3 principles must be met by any would-be project. Next slide. So this is just an approval process. So the first stage, if you want to invest in a project, in a carbon project in Zambia is you write what we call a mitigation idea note, then we'll issue with what we call an approval, letter of no objection. So for VCM, this would be enough. If a project developer does not want, you just submit a main. Going forward, you pay the request fee for submitting a main, and then we issue with a letter of no objection. Because what project developers would say, no, all I want is a letter of no objection from a host country, because my philanthropists who are buying my credits don't want to apply corresponding adjustment. So you end at this. But if you're going to go on and apply corresponding adjustment, then once we review the main, because the main is like an idea note, then we'll ask you to do what we call a mitigation activity design document, which we used to call PDD under the CDM. So this is a detailed document. Once we look at it, we validate it. I mean, if all is okay, we issue what we call letter of approval and authorization. So yeah, this was a very tricky thing for us, because initially we argued amongst ourselves as to whether we just say a letter of approval. But again, we needed project developers to be comforted that, after investing huge sums of money, you generate credits which the government is not going to authorize. So we issue with a letter of approval and authorization, but that does not really mean all the credits that have been indicated in the MADD will be authorized. We still have to verify that these credits have been generated and they are real. So before issuing a final letter of authorization, I mean, this just gives comfort that the credits that you're going to generate are going to be authorized. But at the point of requesting for corresponding adjustments, you have to come to us so that our registry can also issue, because in essence they're the ones that are going to issue the credits. When you are done and ready to sell your credits, you come to us, and then our registry, which is managed by the Zambia Environmental Management Agency, will issue with the credits or the ITMOs. So this, in a nutshell, is approval processes. For a main, you just get a letter of no objection, and most of the projects are ending at that. But those that would want to ask for corresponding adjustments, they have to go all the way and prepare a project design document, or MADD in this case, which is more detailed. Next slide. So all mitigation activities that are implemented under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and all VCM projects that apply for corresponding adjustments must follow the regulations and requirements that have been provided by the Carbon Market Framework and now the Climate Bill. So VCM projects that want to continue or be implemented without corresponding adjustment must report to be operated by ZEMA. So all projects, whether voluntary or under compliance, must be registered under our registry. So furthermore, requirements of VCM projects will be specified by the upcoming amendment of Statutory Instrument 66. So this actually dealt more with the REDD+ projects, but as I indicated, it has to be amended so that it's in line with our new act, our new Climate Change Act. Next slide. Next slide. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So now let me talk about the fees, share of proceeds, and the benefit sharing. So the framework also establishes set requirements for project developers with regards to the application of fees. So again, these are the fees I talked about when submitting a main and a MADD. There will be charges that will be affected, but we can't for now because we don't have the legal mandate to do that. But once the regulations that will operationalize the act are in place, which we are hoping within the next coming 1 or 2 months, then the fees will be known by everybody. So same applies with share of proceeds, as well as the benefit sharing mechanism. For share of proceeds, what I can indicate to you now is that it's not a one-off figure. The way of couched it is in such a way that it's stratified. So the idea really is to accommodate even small scale projects. So for instance, if a project generates, say, 50,000 tons and they want to apply corresponding adjustments for those. So I'm just giving an example. So per ton, we'll charge $1 for the first 50,000 tons. Then if you go up to 100, we charge 1.5. If you go up to 150, so the figure is not static, it's stratified. The more the credits that you'd want to convert into ITMOs, the more the fee or the share of proceed would be. So fees are costs that will be applicable to project application at 2 stages. That's at main and MADD. And really are meant to cover the administrative processing and evaluation of submissions. Right now, you may ask, how are you doing this, Alick? So at the moment, we're still getting support from SPARC to hold our meetings to review projects. But SPARC is just a program, it won't be there forever. So we need to sustain ourselves, and hence, the fees that we'll be charging. The share of proceeds is a share of emission reduction certificates that can be purposed to cover our MRV operation, cost, and support the National Climate Fund. So this is actually all ring-fenced in our act. So the share of proceeds that we'll be collecting for the ITMOs that will be leaving the country, will be used to cover costs of operating the MRV. At the moment, we are building, or developing our registry with support of, partners like SPARC. But how do we sustain that after the program is over, And so that's the main reason why the share of proceeds has been ring-fenced to sustain the operations of the registry. Then the benefit sharing mechanism basically is a distribution of benefits, both direct and indirect, of project activities, including project funding between different participants and stakeholders. So this SOP shall be collected by the host country on projects developed under 6.2 and on projects carried out for the voluntary carbon market that ask for corresponding adjustments. So whereas SOP may be applicable to all carbon projects requesting corresponding adjustments, the benefit sharing mechanism is and will still be applicable to community conservation and community forest initiatives such as RED+. In fact, benefit sharing, will be more applicable to RED+ projects, which are the majority, in Zambia. Next slide. I hope it's not the last slide. Okay. Yes. So under our carbon market, there's also a requirement for DOEs to be registered. So the carbon market framework facilitates for DOEs to conduct validation and verification of mitigation activities in Zambia under the following conditions. The first one is that a DOE must register with the Department of Green Economy and Environment. So this is a department under the ministry. The DOE must also ensure the incorporation participation of a local national expert in the activities. And the reason is very simple. We really want to build capacity locally. So it will be good for a DOE who is going to come to us and say, okay, I will incorporate one expert in our verification. So the idea really is to help build capacity, in the country, so that, going forward, in a few years, we may have 1 or 2 DOEs that are based in Zambia. So DOEs must be accredited under the UNFCCC or a validation and verification body such as Vera or Gold Standard. So this has been actually framed in our carbon market framework. It's a requirement for any DOE who comes to validate projects. They must be registered under the carbon market framework. That must be the last slide, I think. Let's see. Yeah. So thank you very much. So this is where we are, you know, as a country. So what really is just remaining for us is finalize our regulations to operationalize the act. Then, you know, we'll have a full-fledged, you know, carbon market framework in Zambia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muvundika. It was a very thorough presentation. I think we had questions coming in on the benefit sharing and also on the share of proceeds, but we feel like you've adequately answered them in your presentation as well. Just a note for our audience, we will be taking questions with Dr. Muvundika for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. And your screen will also pop up a survey question, and your help when answering the survey will be very useful for us because we use that feedback for improving our future webinars going forward. So please do fill in the survey, and we will be taking your questions from the Q&A function to Dr. Muvundika. So, Dr. Alick, the first question for you, I think you've already touched upon it a little bit, but maybe some elaboration on it. How will the carbon market framework, the SI66 and EPJSLP, I believe you touched upon it in the form of RED+, how will they operate together? So far, it seems that these instruments are not complementary.
Exactly. And you're spot on, you know, and this is actually the question which project developers have been asking us, you know, they've been asking, you know, that there's confusion. So as things stand, the carbon market framework is the main framework that we use. The SI66 only applies to RED+ projects, but as I indicated, it's actually being, you know, worked on so that it's in line with our Climate Change Act. So within a few months, it will be aligned with the Climate Change Act, because as things stand now, it's very, very confusing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of current approvals, we are using the carbon market framework.
Thank you very much. Then there's a question on two types of questions on the registry. So what has been Zambia's challenge in the implementation of the national registration system? Do all the activity participants understand it?
Okay, so at the moment, our registry is not yet up and running. It's actually still being developed. So, I mean, I can't say much because, you know, until we have it, you know, up and running, that's when we'll see the challenges. But it's still being developed, and we're hoping to have it finalized maybe by the fourth quarter or third quarter of this year. So right now, you know, we're getting support from SPARC, as well as there's another partner who is helping us to develop the registry. But obviously, we would want it also to be linked to the international registry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because
Thank
of
you,
the
Dr.
bilateral agreements that we're having. So, you know, we would want it to be very transparent.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good. We don't see you anymore, unfortunately. I'm
Oh, you
not
want to
sure
see
if
me?
that's... Yeah, that'll be great.
Okay, no,
To
it's
see you
because
as well.
my connection was unstable, so I thought, you know.
Oh, no worries. I'll let
Yeah,
you know if
yeah.
there are any further connection issues, but thank you very much. We can see you now.
Okay.
So just continuing on the registry topic, there was also a question on how Zambia sort of funds or brings in the resources to cover the operational cost of Article 6 implementation and also the operation and maintenance of the registry.
Very good question. I think I touched on this, you know, in my presentation, and you know, this is something that we've identified, that how are we going to operate the registry, you know, post SPARC, post this support that we're having. How are we going to have these meetings, you know, post SPARC? So that's why we came up with these fees that we'll be charging for submission of a main and submission of a MADD. So the fees for submission of a main and MADD will also be reinforced so that they're used specifically for the DNA or by the DNA. Because there are some projects that will be too complicated and we'll need to engage a consultant. Where do we get the resources? So it's those resources that we'll be using for purposes like that. In terms of the registry, the SOP, you know, the share of proceeds that will be charged has also been reinforced under the Act. so that it's channeled to support the operation of the registry. Once the support that we're currently receiving, is no more. At the moment, we're still lucky because we have partners that are helping us, come develop this registry. But how are we going to sustain, once they're gone? So the SOP, share of proceeds, will help us, sustain the operations of the registry. But also, we'll need, staff. In this part of the world, getting right, staff is a challenge. So we hope to be using resources from, the SOPs to also attract staff that will be managing the registry.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Alick. There are a few questions on engagement with other countries. So what kind of engagement is Zambia having with Germany under Article 6? Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes. So you remember the EU in their domestic policies, they're not, they indicated that they're not going to use the carbon market. But I think we're seeing a change with the new government in Germany. I think there's an indication that there will be a buyer, So already, we've already actually started talking to them. There's an indication that they'll be interested, in working with us under Article 6. So to us, that's a good opportunity. So that will be in addition to the MOU that we already have with Norway. In fact, we have a Norwegian delegation in June coming to Zambia to actually start identifying projects that could be supported under Article 6. And already one sector which looks promising is the cement sector. We have also the Creek Foundation. We're actually finalizing the bilateral, agreement. We're almost there, so they're also looking for actual projects. We want actually to be the first ones in Africa to have an Article 6 project, if not second from Ghana. So we're actually moving from talking to actual implementation. And we're hoping with the Norwegians coming in next month, and of course the Creek Foundation, who are interested in actual projects, we hope to hit the ground running, before the end of the year with at least, some projects.
Thank you, Dr. Alick. That is quite great to hear. There is a question on the Singapore engagement as well. I understand that Singapore has signed MOU with Zambia, and it is informed that projects should contribute climate adaptation in Zambia, and this is done by contributing 5% share of the authorized carbon credits. So is this 5% on top of the Sustainable Development Initiative that you mentioned in your presentation?
Well, so with Singapore, what we signed at the moment is an MOU. We haven't gone into the actual detailed, bilateral agreements. But suffice to say, under 6.2, there will be share of proceeds, and whose figure I can't, divulge now because the regulations are not yet out. But once they are out, the figures will be there for public consumption. So I think it's too early days for me to divulge into what will be the share of proceeds, under these arrangements, not only with Singapore, but with other bilateral, partners that, we are talking to.
Yeah.
But as you, I don't know, the 5% because only applies for 6.4, projects. So I don't know whether the question is coming from that perspective that, are you going to apply 5% under 6.2 so that you mirror, what is under 6.4? I'm not sure, the person who asked that question.
It doesn't specify at this stage, but let's see if we get a clarification on that.
Okay.
But meanwhile, there is a very interesting question on how you have incorporated the diverse perspectives of the different stakeholders while developing this carbon market framework. And were there any lessons learned that you can share with other governments that are currently in the process of developing their framework?
Yes. Very good question. It was really interesting, that I did not know before the carbon framework, that we had so many carbon projects in the country. We only came to know about these projects, once the carbon market framework was up and running. So it's really important for other countries to come up with frameworks, because they need to help you, track, who is where, and what is, where. So with our carbon market framework, requiring all project developers to register with us, it has actually helped us know who is operating where, because it's now a mandatory requirement that all project developers, whether you're VCM or compliance, you must register with the government. Yeah. So now we have a database of who is operating where, which company is operating in Zambia. Previously, before the carbon market framework, we didn't know. I thought we just had about 5 or 6. But when the carbon market framework was up and running, we realized that there were more than 60 projects running in the country. So it's really helped us, know who is operating where. We have a lot of these, cook stove projects, Red Plus projects running, which have only been known after the operationalization of the carbon market framework. So the framework is really, really key,
And do you see a benefit in sort of involving these stakeholders for getting feedback on the framework at an early stage, or is this something that governments typically do by themselves and then engage the stakeholders? How did it go in Zambia?
Very, very good question. It's always important, to have feedback from all the stakeholders, including project developers. So remember what we did? We started with the what was the name of our initial carbon market framework? It was provisional. So we had project developers comment on it. So we took on board all those comments and incorporated them into now the finalized carbon market framework. The initial guidelines, which you guys looked at, in that report, that was the initial one, So we got a lot of feedback from project developers on where we needed improvements, and we took them on board. So if you look at our carbon market framework now, I think it has incorporated all the comments that were received from all the relevant stakeholders, including project developers. So it's very, very important. You can't just sit in a corner as government, come up with, a framework. No. You need to involve, all the relevant stakeholders.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Dr. Muvundika. We're already very close to being half an hour over our initial time slot, but thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. You had a great presentation, and all the questions that you answered were quite educational for me, and I hope the audience as well. Just a quick reminder to our audience, if you have not responded to the survey, please do so, and we will see you in our next webinar. A kind note to the panelists and speakers, if you could switch on your video, we can take a group photo before we end the webinar. But thank you all for participating.